Alright, it's time to learn something using research by performing a non-experimental study? Wait. Is it possible to have a non-experimental study? Is that sort of like having sugar-free candy? Is it something that you're supposed to have that is replaced by something that makes you scratch your head? Before we discuss research designs, though, you need a brief walkthrough of some of the terms I'm going to throw at you. A predictor variable is the portion of the experiment that is being manipulated to see if it has an effect on the dependent variable. For example, do people eat more Gouda or cheddar cheese? The predictor variable in this is the type of cheese. Now every time you eat cheese, you'll think about predictor variables. When I say subjects, I just mean the people in the experiment or the people being studied. Experimental research is when a researcher is able to manipulate the predictor variable and subjects to identify a cause and effect relationship. This typically requires the research to be conducted in a lab, with one group being placed in an experimental group, or the ones being manipulated, while the other is placed in a placebo group, or an inert condition or non-manipulated group. A laboratory-based experiment gives a high level of control and reliability. Non-experimental research is the label given to a study when a researcher cannot control, manipulate, or alter the predictor variable or subjects, but instead relies on interpretation, observation, or interactions to come to a conclusion. Typically, this means a non-experimental researcher must rely on correlations, surveys, or case studies and cannot demonstrate a true cause and effect relationship. Non-experimental research tends to have a high level of external validity, meaning it can be generalized to a larger population. So, now that we have the basics of what they are, we can see some of the differences between them. Obviously, the first thing is the very basis of what they're looking at, their methodology. Experimental researchers are capable of performing experiments on people and manipulating the predictor variables. Non-experimental researchers are forced to observe and interpret what they are looking at. Being able to manipulate and control something leads to the next big difference. The ability to find a cause and effect relationship is kind of a big deal in the world of science. Being able to say X causes Y is something that has a lot of power. While non-experimental research can come close, non-experimental researchers cannot say with absolute certainty that X leads to Y. This is because there may be something it did not observe, and it must rely on less direct ways to measure. For example, let's say we're curious about how violent men and women are. We cannot have a true experimental study because our predictor variable for violence is gender. To have a true experimental study, we would need to be able to manipulate the predictor variable. If we had a way to switch men into women and women into men back and forth, so that we could see which gender is more violent, then we could run a true experimental study. But we can't do that, so our little experiment becomes a non-experimental study because we cannot manipulate our predictor variable. There appears to be only disadvantages to non-experimental research. It cannot find cause and effect relationships, cannot manipulate predictor variables, and the methods of study are often correlation or case studies. There are clear-cut disadvantages to non-experimental designs. However, non-experimental research does have at least some advantages over experimental designs. A non-experimental study picks up the slack from an experimental design. As discussed earlier, to study the effects of gender, you have to be able to manipulate a person's gender. Other examples of non-experimental research include predictor variables like age, ethnicity, prison sentences, real prisoners, not like Zimbardo students, bereavement, and current opinions. If you can't manipulate it, then you can't run an experimental study. However, non-experimental researchers are able to take the variables that cannot be manipulated and controlled. The non-experimental design can study and examine questions experimental researchers cannot. Experimental researchers have strong advantages, like we discussed earlier. Examples of this include cause and effect, a high level of control, and the ability to replicate the study in nearly the exact circumstances. These are powerful forms of evidence in the world of science and should be marked as definitive advantages to experimental research design. There is the ability to manipulate variables like rewards, types of therapy received, crowds in conformity, influence by television, and leading questions. By manipulating the primary variable, the researcher is able to learn a great deal, as well as point to the manipulated variable as the causal change. For example, one study by Elizabeth Loftus had subjects view the same video of one car rear-ending another. Afterwards, the viewers were asked, how fast was the car going when it bumped into the next car? Or, how fast was the car going when it careened and crashed into the next car? The answers varied significantly, but everyone had seen the same video. Some disadvantages, if you haven't guessed, are the limits of what you can manipulate. An experimenter cannot manipulate gender, age, or a person's real life. This means some possible studies can never be true experimental studies. In addition, the sterile lab, while great for making it reproducible, makes it somewhat sterile for trying to apply it to the real world. For instance, shoot or no-shoot police officer situations are studied in the laboratory. While it can tell us a great deal about the decision-making process of people in a specific situation, it does not accurately reproduce the adrenaline of going into the situation, the discomfort of wearing body armor, and the recall of the training received in real time. Non-experimental research does not mean non-scientific. Non-experimental research means there is a predictor variable or group of subjects that cannot be manipulated by the experimenter. Typically, this means that other routes must be used to draw conclusions, such as correlation, survey, or case study. Experimental design, on the other hand, allows for researchers to manipulate the predictor variable and subjects. This allows the researcher to identify cause and effect relationships, which is a great advantage to experimental designs. The disadvantage of experimental designs is that they are extremely limited, many variables impossible or unethical to manipulate. Non-experimental design advantages allow the variables to be studied, but without the strength of the experimental design.